Hey. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, the Institute's president, and we are genuinely thrilled today to have with us the Honorable Jared Bernstein, chair of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors for President Biden. He's going to be talking about the benefits of full employment. This is in some ways, the hottest and possibly the most important topic in macroeconomic policy. And I want to give full credit to Jared and his colleagues at the CEA who've been on this topic and doing research and advocacy and policy advice, most importantly, in real time throughout the Biden administration with the benefits of full employment in mind. The attention goes a lot, rightly, to the Federal Reserve and the so-called soft landing, but the attention in terms of understanding why it became a soft landing and what role fiscal policy and other structural policies played, rightly, is evaluated in the latest economic report of the president. And if I can grab one of my free copies. These are, of course, free to everyone.
I remember saying that.
The government publishing office has it online, and if you're watching on PIIE.com, we have the link. You can get your own 2,000-page copy. But what is remarkable in the current edition that the CEA has put out under Jared's leadership, with obviously contributions from Heather Boucher and other key staff, is the first chapter on the benefits of full employment. Not only why it matters, but bringing into the macro discussion the issues of monopsony, which is hiring power as a distortion of markets, evaluating the long-term trends and to some degree why people were perhaps too pessimistic about those in the past, looking about why and how a rising tide in this case lifted the smaller boats and arguably lifted the smaller boats more than the yachts, which is an outcome that we didn't all think could happen, but did. So it is a very exciting time to be talking about the economic report of the president. Before I formally introduce Jared, just a note that unofficially, with Jared here and the cherry blossoms past peak, it's the official start of macro season at Peterson Institute. We have quite the lineup. Of course, nothing is as good as hearing Jared, but we have quite the lineup over the next few weeks that we hope you all will be joining us, and maybe even C-SPAN will deign to come back for some of these events, including next week on March 27th, that's later this week, Nicholas Verone, Sheila Bair, and Graham Steele on the future of the U.S. banking sector. Our semi-annual Global Economic Prospects event led by Karen Dinan on the U.S. economy, with remarks by Tianlei Huang on the Chinese economy and Maury Obstveld on our lessons from exchange rates. An update on Too Big to Fail with Martin Grunberg, the chair of the FDIC, and Tobias Adrian from the IMF, among others, taking place on Wednesday, April 10th. And then a horde of central bankers and those who love them in the following week. In particular, I want to feature, relating to some of the other themes in this year's economic report of the president, our joint conference with the IMF on steering structural change, the latest in our biannual Rethinking Economic Policy conferences. We're grateful to partnership with Pietro Toplov and Pierre-Olivier Garinchas and the whole IMF on that. If we're going to have green growth, if we're going to have greater equality, if we're going to deal with AI, we have to be able to steer structural change and have structural change mean something more than it used to, which is the OECD laundry list of liberalization. And we're very hopeful that our conference, which I believe includes a colleague or two from the CEA, will be addressing those challenges. But again, let's start off with the most important document on the most important topic of the day, which is the benefits of full employment today. And we are indeed fortunate that Jared Bernstein and the Council of Economic Advisors chose the Peterson Institute for this discussion. Jared has been chair of the 31st chair of the Council of Economic Advisors since being confirmed in the Senate last June. He serves as President Biden's chief economist and a member of the cabinet, but of course, Jared served as a CEA member from the beginning of the Biden-Harris administration and was a prominent voice in public as well as in policy discussions on all the macroeconomic issues of the Biden administration and therefore this country. In policy, he was previously chief economist and economic advisor to then Vice President Biden from 2009 to 2011 and served as deputy chief economist at the Department of Labor during the Clinton administration. Dr. Bernstein was a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities from 2011 to 20, and he also spent 16 years in senior roles at the Economic Policy Institute, which of course understates that he played a key intellectual leadership role in making the EPI what it has become. Dr. Bernstein has spoken here at the Peterson Institute before and worldwide, and in particular, he has always been interested in the juncture of inequality, macroeconomics, labor markets, and trade as well as the living standards of the middle class. I know that Jared's also going to open briefly with some remarks about someone we lost who shared a similar focus at that conjuncture of issues. But most of all today, I'm glad that we can all focus on the fact that full employment has been attainable and that the benefits have become evident. And that is a positive challenge to macroeconomic policy going forward. So with that, let me invite Jared Bernstein to the podium.
Before I thank Adam and PIIE, I just want to say a minute or two about the tragic collapse of the bridge in Baltimore. We spent the morning at the White House trying to do all we can to help. The president, I think, just finished speaking about this. He talked about the scope of the tragedy and how he's incredibly grateful to the brave rescuers who immediately got to the scene, and talked about the people of Baltimore and how we're with you, we'll stay with you. He and the governor talked about Maryland tough and Baltimore strong, which means something to folks in this room who know what I'm talking about. We will get through this, and we at the White House will be with you every inch of the way. Now, turning to today's presentation, it is true that like the cherry blossoms, I am past my peak, but I still am excited to talk about this subject with you. I want to thank Adam. He was the first person I thought of, and PIIE was first place I thought of when we thought about where we'd like to present this information from the new economic report of the president. I want to thank my friend David Wilcox, who helps guide my thinking on this and many other issues. I have a brief set of comments, or briefish set of comments, and then we will, Adam and I will chat, and hopefully we'll take some questions. On February 5th, 2021, what I believe was his first economic speech since he took office, President Biden discussed the urgency of his newly proposed American Rescue Plan by elevating the need to quickly get back to full employment. In fact, he used the phrase 5 times in that speech. I guess somebody else is controlling these, because I didn't make that happen, but okay. I think, yeah, okay, I'll do that if that's okay, not to be controlling, but I have this here. He pointed out that according to CBO, quote, if we don't take action, it would take until the year 2025 to return to full employment. He cited outside estimates maintaining that if we enact the rescue plan, we could, quote, achieve full employment by the beginning of next year, citing the importance of standing up a nationwide vaccination program, which, as you recall, did not exist when we took office. He argued that we can, quote, get to full employment sooner. Why was this new president invoking a concept that was heretofore not that much spoken of outside of think tanks, and even there, mostly those that were labeled progressive or labor-oriented? That's not a rhetorical question. I know the answer. It's that President Biden has always believed that worker bargaining power is an essential ingredient to an economy that's fair, inclusive, and it stands in sharp contrast with trickle-down economics, grows the economy from the middle out, bottom up, not the top down. And that full employment supports the bargaining clout that he views as so critical. It's why empowering workers would later be enumerated as one of the 3 pillars of Bidenomics. And it's why, quote, the benefits of full employment is the first chapter of CEA's new economic report of the president. I'll note here, and as you see in front of you, that the chapter was dedicated to my late friend and mentor, Bill Spriggs, who taught me this importance of full employment. I also want to recognize my colleague, CEA's chief economist, Dave Ratner, who was and is instrumental in our work in this space. Now, for an economist audience, this policy thrust invokes big, important questions of the type Adam just alluded to. What do we mean by full employment? What specifically are the benefits of full employment? Which policies help us get there and stay there? While CEA touts the benefits of full employment, what are the costs, particularly in terms of inflation? Is full employment sufficient to achieve our economic goals, or are there economically vulnerable groups that need other policies to connect their fortunes to overall growth? The chapter answers all of these questions in some depth, emphasizing both theory and extensive evidence, some of which I'll share with you in a moment. But since I want to move quickly to our discussion, I'll only skim the surface of the answers here. Before I get into that, I thought this was an interesting find from 1731. The statement here was that this was the earliest reference we could find to full employment. I know back then they used capital letters fairly randomly, as I see it. I'm not sure we would agree about a universal cheerfulness to everybody, but that's not one of the benefits we tout. But I just thought it was interesting. Riches are diffused over the nation. That's a very clear statement of the equality premium that we talk about that's associated with full employment. But the first question is what do we mean? For this crowd, I'm sure it's standard thinking that U could equal U star, the lowest unemployment rate consistent with steady inflation. That's very conventional. Not that that necessarily tells you what U star is, but it is a widely used guidepost. Perhaps a more concrete perspective is that when unemployment is at its natural rate, additional demand for workers is more likely to generate inflation than boost real incomes. That's in the chapter. Dave and I did an interview right after we wrote the chapter, and the first question the reporter asked is, well, what do you think full employment? Like, what's the number? And we both sort of looked at each other like, how could we not have prepared for that question? The new administration forecast that just came out in the budget has our terminal unemployment rate at 3.8, but there's a wide confidence interval around this and other star estimates. I think the historical record, though, certainly would lead me to believe that based on current demographics, U-star would be, below 4 and maybe well below, in the 3 to 4 range. But turning to the heart of the chapter, which is the benefits of full employment, I'd put them in 3 buckets. First, the enhanced bargaining power I mentioned that comes with full employment distributes more resources to those who would have relatively and absolutely less resources in weaker labor markets. Some have called this full employment's, quote, equality premium. The empirical evidence of that dominates the chapter, and I'll take you through that in a second. Second is this middle outgrowth contention, the idea that in a 70% consumer spending economy like ours, a strong labor market generating broad-based real wage gains helps to promote steady and stable growth. The chapter says little about this, but I've talked a lot about it in the context of the current recovery, and this dynamic has been especially important as excess savings have largely burned off and real earnings have helped to pick up some of that slack. Third, more speculative benefits around what has been called Verdorn's law or reverse hysteresis, the idea that full employment can generate gains to productivity growth through boosting the economy's supply side. So now let me take you on a quick tour of the evidence, starting with estimates of the natural rate of full employment, which, simply put, are quite wide and quite varied. if we want to, we can talk about why there are so many different estimates of full employment. But the point here is that it has, like many other star variables, it's been a number that's been tough to pin down. I will point out that that straight line, the CBO U-star measure, is one that gets used a lot, in no small part because it's really easy to point and click and get to it. And it is clearly far less noisy than the rest. It's also far less noisy than, it's also far less noisy than earlier CBO measures. And the reason is that they switched a bit ago to something they call they refer to this now as the non-cyclical unemployment rate, which what they do is I believe it was in 2005 Q4, they decide this looks like full employment to us. So they assume that U was U star in 2005 Q4, and going forward and back, they estimate the non-cyclical unemployment rate holding demographics, which in this case are sex, education, age, and race, constant. And so that's why you get that kind of a flat line. Okay, now turning to more, I'm going to buzz through this stuff. This is the idea that the rising tide lifts some boats more than others, as Adam alluded to. We now have the lowest black-white unemployment gap on record. This separates it out for men and women. This is based on work that Kashner and others, including Dave, did at the Federal Reserve. And you see, a fairly clear cyclical pattern there, although not much happening in the 2000s. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the really marked full employment periods, at least in recent history, were the latter 90s and the current period. And there you see much more cyclical response of this racial gap. That was the unemployment gap, or black unemployment minus white unemployment. I believe it was, yes, for prime age. No, it wasn't for prime age workers, but it was regression adjusted for demographics and such. This is the same exercise with the employment rate. And here we have the Hispanic versus the white gap in the EPOP. And again, you see in the period, you see a cyclical increase there, though more linear than the unemployment one. We have a number of scatter plots in the chapter. This one, inspired by some work that Justin Wolfers has done, looks at both the cyclicality of the unemployment rate and the LFPR, the labor force participation rate. And what you see here on the left is that groups with the lowest average unemployment rate over quite a long period, so groups that tend to have low unemployment, don't have much variation in the unemployment rate, the absolute change in the unemployment rate over expansions and recessions. So if you're college educated, you're less exposed to cyclical ups and downs. But if you're someone with high school or less, over there on the upper right, you have average high unemployment, and yet your unemployment rate goes up and down a lot more in recessions and recoveries. So this is absolute change. So, down in recessions, up in recoveries. And that's behind that black-white gap closure that I showed you in a moment. So one of the really important benefits of full employment is this dynamic of racial equity in the labor market. You see the same thing in the LFPR. The cyclicality of the LFPR is that groups with a low average LFPR have more variation in their labor force participation rates relative to those with much higher LFPR. So this is, something I'll come back to later when I talk about the possibility of lasting supply-side gains. This is an interesting take on something you may have seen less of before. It talks about how the job ladder becomes more accessible to less advantaged workers in periods of full employment. We know that in strong labor markets, workers are more likely to quit to rise up the job ladder. We've seen that. I'll come back to that a little bit when I talk about some recent beverage curve research. But higher quit rates mean that the job ladder in periods of full employment becomes even more accessible to more vulnerable workers. What the chart shows is that when the unemployment rate is low, the job-to-job switching rate rises more for black workers than for white workers. And that's probably, at least in my work on full employment, that's a perspective I hadn't seen before. So job-to-job switches more advantageous for less advantaged workers in periods of tight labor markets. That's a great finding vis-a-vis upward mobility. This is just the transition rate for disabled workers from non-participation to employment, and you see a nice uptick in the full employment period of the latter 90s and the full employment period of the last expansion and where we are now. Again, not much in the 2000s, where I would argue we were less at full employment. This is, I think, a particularly important story right now. This is, again, the equality premium. Here you see wages for the 10th and the 90th percentile workers, hourly wages indexed to 100 in 2015. They grow together they're growing in real terms, which is good to see in the past expansion. In this expansion, you see the 10th percentile pull ahead, and so you have full employment generating more wage equality in that context. This is another kind of a deeper, in a way, a deeper dimension of the kind of premium I was talking about for full employment in terms of where the benefits disproportionately flow. Here we're simulating the increase of a more slack labor market, but it's symmetric. You could just flip this around if you wanted to do a more tight labor market. But it shows how households, and now we're talking about household income. So this is a broader concept, and here you see the change associated with a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate gap. So a larger unemployment rate gap, a more negative output gap, you see that for all households, black households and single mother households, that turns into a 2% elasticity in terms of the loss of annual earnings. And that gradient there shows you that it doesn't really matter very much for high income families, but for particularly for black households, single mother households, really up to the middle there, the elasticity is either unity or greater than unity. So I think that's another, a good example of that. And again, because that's income, it includes both a wage effect and an hours effect. In some work I've done, the hours effect is actually a very potent part of this, and you kind of got that sense from the LFPR graph earlier, showing groups with lower LFPRs having more positive cyclical responses to full employment. Here's one I wonder if you've seen before. This is the change in the labor share and the unemployment rate gap. So again, as you move to the right, the economy becomes more slack. U grows relative to U star, so the gap grows. And what you see there is that when you have a negative gap, or you're below U star, you're at full employment or below, labor share is increasing, and that's the 4-quarter change in labor share of income on the y-axis. So that correlation there shows a negative correlation between output gaps and labor share growth for labor share of national income. Okay, getting to and staying at full employment. This is, as I mentioned, another one of the questions that, hold on a second, I got myself a little turned around here. Got my pages. Here we go. What I just took you through is a subset of the benefits to workers that we stress in the chapter. By the way, we're clear that full employment is no panacea, and we include a detailed discussion of policies that go beyond the reach of full employment, including anti-discrimination policies, affordable childcare, and housing. But we also speculate a bit, without getting too far over our skis, on the possibility that persistent periods of full employment could induce supply-side gains or generate reverse hysteresis that could raise the potential growth rate. Now, there's at least two ways that might happen, with the first backed by more supportive evidence than the second. As I showed a moment ago, labor supply is somewhat pro-cyclical. That's what I showed you with that LFPR scatter plot. Persistently full employment labor markets can pull in groups of workers from the sidelines who would stay out of the game in weaker labor markets, and this certainly tracks the current expansion in ways that I think are very important. This just shows prime-age labor force growth year-over-year percent change, and it just shows that for prime-age workers, the increase that in the last couple of years has been, historically quite strong. I mean, that mountain you see there is really been quite important to the expansion. And I should point out that recent research by CBO and others suggests that both native and foreign-born workers are playing a significant role in that recent expansion. The current labor force participation rate for women aged 25 to 54 is a tick below its highest rate on record, with data back to the late 1940s. So I think there's a case to be made in terms of supply-side gains related to full employment, although how long they last is up for grabs. Second, and much more heretical to an economist audience like this one, because full employment raises real earnings, firms that want to maintain their margins will try to prevent unit labor costs from rising. Now, the labor share figure I showed you earlier shows that they're not entirely successful in doing so, but one way that they can stabilize their unit labor costs is to discover efficiency gains that were not necessary to tap in slack periods. The problem, of course, is that by assumption, any firm operating inside its production possibilities frontier should have been competed out of business. So I recognize that that explanation collides with some basic assumptions in micro, but I think that's okay. Others have made this potential connection. You see some of the citations here. Between persistently full employment and lasting supply-side gains. Secretary Yellen did so in a 2016 speech. David Wilcox here at PIIE has done so in various writings. Though Aronson, Wilcox et al. Ended impressively empirical dive into the question from 2016 with the sentence, quote, "The evidence of highly persistent beneficial effects on the supply side of the economy in past events is not strong." That doesn't say they don't exist, but that they're not strong, at least as their evidentiary dive back in 2016. We're with Stephanie and David et al., but also like them, we don't dismiss the possibility of a linkage between full employment and lasting supply-side gains. We've seen a bit of productivity acceleration in the current expansion, as this slide shows. Although its level is largely back on trend, that's a trend from 2017 to 2019, its level is largely back on trend, and some nice work by our team at CEA suggests it takes 2 to 3 years, or at least it took 2 to 3 years in the 1990s to identify a higher growth trend in productivity. But we also think that Justin Wolfers makes a great point that wherever you land on the full employment reverse hysteresis argument, the fact that it yields such strong equality dividends is reason enough to elevate it as a policy goal. To argue that it also must permanently raise Y star may be getting a little greedy. In terms of our policies that get us and keep us to full employment, we largely focus on not learning the wrong lesson from the post-pandemic period, and particularly the inflationary episode we're still working our way through. The idea that fiscal and monetary policy should be used to fill negative output gaps seems widely accepted, but we worry that the next time out, policymakers will incorrectly assume that countercyclical policies are unacceptably inflationary. Thus, in the chapter, we focus on the relative roles of supply, demand, and the persistent full employment of the past few years and their relationship to the rise of inflation over 2021 and 22. In the previous ERP, we argued that the collision of pandemic-induced supply disruptions and strong consumer demand that shifted firmly toward the very goods that were most supply constrained contributed to the rise in inflation. Demand, we argued, was boosted by the accumulation of excess savings, which in turn related again to sharp reductions in pandemic-induced spending on services and travel, supported by strong fiscal and monetary support throughout 20 and 21, I should say. Now, in the new volume, we write, quote, "Given the developments over the years since the previous assessment, the CEA has found more evidence that supply factors played a key role in both inflation's rise and its subsequent decline. Consider that if full employment were the main cause of the increase in inflation, the subsequent disinflation the economy has experienced should have brought about a substantial slackening of the labor market. However, the low magnitude of the so-called sacrifice ratio, the amount of increased unemployment or reduced economic activity required to lower inflation during the recent disinflation since the peak in June 2022, suggests otherwise. Over the period covered, which includes the most recent data available when we published the book, the disinflation has required little sacrifice in terms of labor market slack or job loss." In a complementary analysis that we just updated using the renowned Yellen-Price Phillips curve model supplemented with the New York Fed's supply chain variable, so kind of in the spirit of the Bernanke-Blanchard analysis, we find that supply chain normalization, either on its own or interacted with slack, and that's important, explain about 80% of the disinflation in the core PCE through Q4 of this year. Now, we've come to view nonlinearities in this Price-Phillips curve as important, a point I raise here in honor of Joe Gagnon and Kristen Forbes et al. Longtime work in this space. And we have our own slide showing a COVID-era Phillips curve nonlinearities using MSA level data. Now, thus far, we've been progressing down the steep part of that curve, which is where the sacrifice ratio is low. That raises good questions about the last mile and whether there will be a tougher slog back to target on the flatter part of the curve. But the chapter also looks at this analysis through, maybe I'll get back to that, through the lens of the beverage curve. As is well known in this institute, Figura and Waller argued that the beverage curve ought to be especially steep at high openings and low unemployment rates, another nonlinearity. The idea is that as vacancies rise relative to the number of unemployed, it becomes increasingly hard to fill jobs, and firms must increasingly post vacancies to fill each open position. That leads to a sticky unemployment rate relative to additional vacancies. Figura and Waller then posited correctly so far that the job openings rate could fall without a large increase in job losses or rise in unemployment as the economy slid down a steep beverage curve. Alternatively, Olivier et al., Damash and Summers argued that such high rates of vacancies were due to a decline in matching efficiency. Because they were skeptical that matching efficiency would markedly improve, they predicted that declines in job openings would be accompanied by increased unemployment, which they showed to be an historical regularity. And we don't know yet if Figura-Waller's mechanism was correct or whether matching efficiency did improve. It is the case that the unusually high level of job-to-job switching, I had a slide on that earlier, which tends to reduce matching efficiency among the unemployed, has come back down post-COVID. At any rate, the slide shows that job openings have fallen substantially with little rise in the unemployment rate. So at this point, our analysis shows substantial disinflation generated by supply-side normalization, including some degree of realignment of supply and demand in the labor market while maintaining full employment conditions. None of this is to suggest that countercyclical policy had nothing to do with the run-up in inflation, though in our model, slack by itself, in a model where slack is interacted with the supply chain variable, explains little of the pandemic inflation and post-pandemic disinflation. I'll close where I started. What this chapter shows is that President Biden's urgency to quickly get the labor market back to full employment has yielded deep and important benefits at both the micro and macro levels. If there's one overarching policy lesson from our work, it is that empowering workers through full employment labor markets remains one of the most important economic policy goals there is. Thank you.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you very much, Jared. As a cabinet official, he always has a hard stop, but given the tragedy in Baltimore today, I think that's even more applicable. So we have roughly 12 minutes. We're all grateful for the vast amount of content that Jared and his CEA team has brought to bear on this issue. What I'd like to do is I'm going to put two questions relatively quickly, then we'll turn to our distinguished in-person audience. This is all on the record.
I can go an extra 5 minutes.
Okay, you can go an extra 5, great.
Sorry.
No, but I'll still stick to only 2 from me, and then we'll go to the audience. And what we'll do is take 2 pairs of 2 questions when we turn to that. So thank you. First up, just picking up on where you ended up, Jared. There was a great deal of debate and concern in 2021, 2022, including from predecessors of yours as CEA chairs in previous Democratic administrations about fiscal policy potentially overheating the economy. And you've been very clear about where your analysis takes you and that it's not, in your analysis, it's not a huge factor. I want to push you on this, not on the allocation of variance in the last couple of years, but more in terms of the applicability of this going forward. That partly, as you and the council have argued, what was going on with inflation was a unique or at least unusual set of supply factors driven by the pandemic, energy, so on. So does this experience feel relevant to you for more, let's call it normal times? That would the inflation effects directly from slack via fiscal policy be more felt under different circumstances, or does this have more general applicability that people have been too concerned about fiscal activism in the past?
I think that one should really give a lot of weight to the unusual dynamics of pandemic economics, and that fiscal policy remains largely innocent and is not proven guilty by this episode. I've tried to stress in all of my discussion, including my words here today, that none of that says fiscal policy had nothing to do with it, and in fact, I was talking in the, actually before Cece got there, I was speaking, I recall, in the press briefing and saying, I do think the rescue plan is going to generate some inflation. At that point, I think inflation was negative.
Right.
And I was pretty confident I was right. I think that there are a number of facts that push you in that direction. The nonlinearities are really important, and at PIIE, again, with Joe and others' work, I think you've shown the importance of that. And I think those nonlinearities are very much a function of a highly snarled supply chains and a supply, and labor supply as well, bumping up against quite strong demand. And look, fiscal policy played a role in sustaining the strength of demand. So that's why we thought it was important to interact slack and fiscal policy in the model. That said, one of the biggest lessons I think everyone should take away from this is watch your supply side.
Right.
Watch your supply side. You don't assume it's going to do what you want it to do. Of course, a 100-year pandemic is a particularly challenging data point if you haven't, gone through that. So generally speaking, I think the comments I made in the talk and what I just reflected here suggest that a fairly aggressive, quick fiscal policy response to negative output gaps remains really important, really warranted. Getting back to full employment as quickly as possible is the best policy, and be mindful of your supply side.
Thank you. Very clear. A second question, something that I did read the report before I got my lovely hard copy. Something which wasn't featured either in the report or chapter 1 of the report or your discussion today when you talk about labor supply has been the surge in immigration we've seen in the last year or two in the US, which frankly, most of us at Peterson Institute welcome, although it's obviously controversial in places. But just analytically speaking, when you talk about the improvements in labor supply, how much does the return of both documented and undocumented workers to the US affect labor supply? And does it actually suggest, being wishful here, but maybe you agree, that if the immigrants to the US at least are not a major determinant of domestic worker bargaining power, since you've shown evidence that workers had greater bargaining power the last couple of years, even as we've seen this rise in migration?
Right. I mean, immigration creates supply and demand.
Right.
That's very important to remember. I think I should start by first saying that President Biden has said unequivocally that the border is broken and needs to be fixed, has presented extremely ambitious and, in my view, potentially highly effective policies to fix the border, and the opposition has largely treated that as a political football as opposed to trying to solve a serious problem. With that said, CEA has documented the increase in labor supply, as I mentioned in my talk, as coming from both foreign-born and native-born sources. And when we talk about supply chain unsnarling, if I'm being more disciplined, I say supply chain and labor supply improvements. And so that immigration certainly plays a role there.
Thank you. I'm now going to turn to our audience. We have a standing mic to my left, about 2/3 of the way back in the room. That's so you can appear nicely on TV. We also have a roving mic in Jessica's hands that can come to the first couple tables. When called on, please identify yourself, name and affiliation, and please pretend at least you're making a question instead of a statement.
Given that my time is short, yeah, the more we have direct questions.
So the person in the very back, if you could make your way, who just put down your hand, if you could make your way to that microphone, then Joe Gagnon here, and then we'll come back to that mic. Thank you. So you're up first.
So Claire Jones, Financial Times. There seems to have been a global trend where the response rates in a lot of the labour market surveys have fallen quite substantially over the past, say, decade or so. And then what you've had recently is that coupled with, pandemic era shifts in working practices, and then also trends such as Adam pointed out about immigration. This seems to be leading to some concerns about the quality of the sort of data that we're getting on the labour market. So I guess two issues for you. One, do you share those concerns about the quality of labour market data? And two, what would you suggest to do to rectify some of the issues that we've seen with lower response rates?
Thank you.
We want to make sure that you can escape. So Joe, if you could pose your question, then you'll respond. And
yeah,
then
I will. That's a good question.
We'll come back to Rich at the mic.
Well, thanks. Joe Gagnon, Peterson Institute. Terrific presentation, Jared. I thought it was, I look forward to reading the chapter, and hopefully it will give me some insights for my own work going forward. Question is, I know that when you looked at inflation in the past few years, you did a big comparison with other countries. Have you thought at all about looking at other countries on this topic, i.e. the benefits and costs of labor market tightness? It seems to me there's really quite a range of experiences both across countries and over time that could be informative. Just wondering if that's something you look at.
Or it could be a good PIIE research project.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I've done a bit of that and I'm thinking about it, but I wondered if you had looked into this or had thoughts about it.
Yeah, let me start with the labor market data question. Now, that's a great question. And let me point out Lee Tucker, who's here from our staff. I had a meeting with Lee right before I came over here. He was raising exactly those points. So talk to Lee afterwards and he'll tell you what we're thinking about that. I think, quickly, the quality of US labor market data remains very high. When you have a survey, I know JOLTS is kind of the poster child where the response rate has been, I think in the 30s or something like that lately. What you have there is, just a wider confidence interval around the estimate. It doesn't mean the estimate is wrong. It just means that it has a larger standard error. And that is something we should definitely try to improve upon. I think BLS is absolutely a fantastic agency who does great work. They're well aware of these issues and are thinking about ways to improve them. I guess what I would say is that the very interesting thing going on right now is I'm sure you know this, I think it was kind of embedded in your question, is the difference between employment in the payroll survey and employment in the household survey. And there's some thinking, I know CBO has talked about this, that the payroll survey may be picking up immigration better than the household survey right now. And so that's a really important thing to think about and to look at. But broadly speaking, at least in the context of the presentation I gave, I feel very confident in the quality of the indicators we're using. So I just think, it's a great idea and would be a great project, Joe. And we've looked a little bit at that. I just think that the labor market and the fiscal policy emphasis was so different in us versus them. So, in Europe, much of the focus was on keeping people on the job. We did a little bit of that with, maybe more than a little with the with the Paycheck Protection Program. But broadly speaking, our significant fiscal spend was in unemployment insurance and checks and money to the states. And I think the fact that we have a 70% consumer spending economy and they have a 55% consumer spending economy made a big difference here. Our fiscal policy went to consumers who have really carried the baton in keeping this recovery going, and their fingerprints are very much on the macro dynamics I've talked about. I suspect it's a little different in Europe. So if one were to do that exercise, and I think one should, because the inflation, of course, was global, and the disinflation has been somewhat global as well. We've done better than most countries in terms of disinflation, but others have engaged in some of that too. I think when one engages in that study, be very important to pay attention to the different fiscal policies, the different policies that were implemented and their impact on full employment. For one thing, our unemployment rate went way up and came way down. That wasn't the case in these countries. It didn't go up as much, it didn't come down as much.
Yep. Back at the mic.
Thanks very much for this presentation. Rich Miller from Bloomberg. There's some economists who say we're sort of moving from a disinflationary time where the structural forces were pushing down inflation to a more like demographics, globalization, to a time where the pressures are going to be on the opposite side. I'm wondering what you think of that argument, and in light of this, how might that change the risk reward around running a full, like a high pressure economy, which is kind of what you're advocating? Thank you very much.
I think the lesson of the last the lesson of virtually all the years we review in the chapter, which I think probably most closely would be, the last 40 plus 50 years, would be that given the general flatness of the Phillips curve, at least maybe not the last 40 years, but the last 20 years for sure, given the general flatness of the Phillips curve, one can pursue full employment economies without unduly worrying about inflationary pressures. And of course, if you just look at the basic architecture of the economic theory behind all this, if U is equal to U star, inflation should be stable. So, what I tried to do in my talk is to break out some unique factors that persisted in the pandemic, particularly the nonlinearities and the collision of strong demand with constrained supply. And recognizing that that was very much a piece of pandemic economics, not necessarily a structurally embedded factor in the economy going forward. Now, I can't claim to know what the slope of the Phillips curve will be on the other side of this. Maybe it'll be a little bit steeper. But what I can tell you is that all the forecasts, I follow them all. I think the ones that have been most accurate, I'm thinking of some of the work of Goldman Sachs, for instance, they've been very good on this, continue having inflation staying on trend. So we come away from this chapter with a very unequivocal view that full employment and stable prices can very happily live together, and that from the perspective of working people, they must.
Great. I think we have time for one last question. Jessica, could you take the mic to Carolyn, please?
Hi, Caroline Atkinson. Thanks very much. Brilliant presentation. I wonder how you feel about policies to ensure the kind of fiscal response that you're suggesting is needed. Because as we know, the pandemic kind of opened a political window for child tax credits, higher unemployment benefits and so on, but that's often not easy. Thanks.
Well, this speaks to uplifting the profile of automatic stabilizers. And my colleague, member Heather Boucher at the Council has written a lot on that point, and I think that work is very strong. It's interestingly been challenged on both sides of the aisle politically. Sometimes I think politicians want to do. Many politicians don't want to have choice. They want to have discretion. But I think that there is, at least among economists and some enlightened legislators, there is a view that whatever can be more automatic should be, because the timing of these things can't people to the extent that there's political back and forth and delay, it can cause real pain that can be avoided and should be avoided, as I've tried to point out, both at the micro level and at the macro level. I think while we can have good and should have arguments about elevating the importance of automatic stabilizers, and the more we put in the automatic column, I think we'd broadly be supportive of that. What's most important is that the next time we hit a downturn, I'm pretty convinced, I don't know what others feel here, that we're going to be hit with voices that say we can't do anything because look what happened last time. And I think that would be a huge mistake.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today, both in person and online at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. We're very proud and glad to have been able to host the Honorable Jared Bernstein, the 31st Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, for a presentation on the first chapter of the Economic Report of the President 2024, the benefits of full employment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.